athletes, soldiers, etc. 2, exercising the mind and the will. St. Paul used the term askio once in the book of Acts, though what it describes is found frequently in his thought. He calls the practice of the godly life exercise. In the Apostolic Fathers and in the 2nd century apologists, who we studied together, he says the Christian was not called asketes, but athletes. And so you actually get this. This is a real thing early in the tradition. We take over in the church the terminology of athletic battle, right? Like the person who's going to exercise, the person who's in the gym, the person who's doing exercises for the military to learn their craft, so on. That term becomes applied equally to the Christian who would exercise himself against the demonic warfare. And we directly, very purposefully, take over in the church the terminology that's applied to valiant effort at achieving an end, to say, like, this is what the ascetic is, this is what Christianity is the one who applies himself to the gospel completely. So St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you might obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown. But we run this race, we, for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. This kind of thinking is already in the biblical text, right? It doesn't need the ascetic fathers that we talk about to come and to elaborate. Like, you're in a warfare. You're not just walking in to fly the lowest altitude you can, to drive at the lowest speed you can, to do the minimum. Sometimes with the way we break sin down as Christians, we see sin as a line we don't cross so that you don't do bad, right? It's the minimum, right, below which we sin. But what sin really is in the desert, in the ascetic fathers, is anything that distracts me from God. Anything that takes me away from my purpose of living in union with God. And so what the ascetic does is to exercise him or herself in the things that can bring me nearer to him, that can rid me of the distractions of the divine, so that I can have a clearer vision and see as God made me to see, and live as God made me to live. That's why we do all these exercises. This is still St. Paul, so you can't accuse me for the long quote. It's not my fault. It's him. It's whatever it is. What it is. There are longer quotes and smaller typing, and I'm sorry. I just can't be helped. So I'm going to read from this computer to change things up. As the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. All of this is very ascetical, right? This is Paul saying, exert yourself. This is St. Paul telling us, like, don't just settle for what's normal. Don't settle for what the world has to offer. Don't settle for flying the minimum, for doing what's barely expected of you. He says, go above and beyond the call of what would normally be that of a human, and exert yourself in order to come to a likeness to what Christ is. Because if the cross back there is the model of Christianity, right? If the cross we wear, the cross we're anointed with, the cross that we look at as the ideal of humanity, if that's the model, then what we're saying is, I have to learn to give of myself and to offer for another. I have to learn to lay down my life so that I might have it once more. And the Lord says this, right? He who loses his life shall gain it. He who gains his life shall lose it. If we follow this pattern, that of the cross, we find real life because He's the one there at the cross. And that's all asceticism is calling us to do. It's not calling us to win our way back to God somehow by our own effort or things like this that it would later be misconstrued as. It's just calling us to live a life fully alive. That's all. That's what the monks see it as. That's what we should see it as. St. John Chrysostom already himself laments in the 4th and 5th century. He dies in the early 5th century, in the 400s. He already laments in his day that nobody was teaching asceticism and the putting off of sin to the youth. He says people all want to educate their kids. Sorry, we're in a Coptic background church. This is going to be really close to home. Everybody wants to educate their kids in some sort of trade, some sort of practice, something that will make them some money, but nobody cares about virtue. And he's saying this already in the 4th and 5th century. What will become of boys when from earliest youth they are without teachers? If grown men, after being nurtured from the womb and continuing their education to old age, do not live righteously, what wrong will not children, accustomed from the threshold of life from birth to empty words, commit? In our own day, every man takes the greatest pains to train his boy in the arts and in literature and in speech, but to exercise his child's soul in virtue, to that no man any longer pays heed. Right? It's very early. This whole it's funny, right? Because often we think like we're fairly unique. You know, our challenges that everybody's like, you know, your parents really just want you to get a job that has like 6 figures or 10 or whatever figures attached to it, and nobody cares about virtue anymore, and people aren't as faithful and whatever. It's lamented in every age, which is what I love reading about the Church Fathers. Because again, like I told you guys last week, we may read certain eras and be like, dude, this was like a golden age. Like there's something that we don't have. And it's probably true. But the challenges that they face are the challenges we face. So Chrysostom, from very early in the life of the church, says people have forgotten this stuff, man. This is what we are made for, and everybody's forgotten to do it. What I wanted also to put at the forefront of your mind is asceticism isn't stoicism. So it's not just the monastics that are ascetics, but I'm also not saying that the ascetic is the one who lives his life as though he doesn't feel anything, right? Often we have this misconstrued idea of the ascetic as the person who sits there like a rock. Beat me with anything and I won't react. Throw anything you want at my head and there'll be no reaction. That's not what the ascetics are like. If you've ever actually met a real monk, right, who's a true ascetic, let's say, usually they're really happy. They're like really giddy. They're kind of childlike. They may be a fool for Christ, or they're actually like an ahbal, like they don't make any sense to you and to me, but they're holier than we could imagine. The monks are very rarely, although some are, of course, there's personalities. The monks who are ascetics are very rarely the type that are just like stone. Like, I don't feel anything. I don't love you. I don't love anyone. I only love God. That's it. Right? That's how we consider this. Because we have a notion of asceticism in Stoicism for the world, and the Stoics are unfeeling, right? They're like, don't be shaken by anything, don't let anybody shake your peace, that's it, and that's all she wrote. But the end of asceticism is actually love. The goal of asceticism is to be able to truly love, to be free of chains so that I can open myself fully to God and to neighbor. And so this other Western author who also writes about the East, this guy writes a series of really good books, but he does this really interesting study where he says, oh, this is what the Eastern monks are going for, and he does this really well. His name's Fagerberg. He says, the purpose of asceticism is not to free the spirit from the body, as some people would have it, right? There are those who live their life thinking asceticism is like that image, poorly construed, of that monk beating his chest and going like, when will I be free of this terrible prison? I hate this body. You know, let me really live. And it's like Jesus became a body, right? The Lord himself took a body. We can't say that and really be Christians to deny the goodness of the body. But he says it's not to separate the spirit from the body, as some philosophers would have it, but to free the spirit and the body from the passions, from the things that hold us back, from the things that chain us. Being body-soul creatures, the remedy has to be applied to the spirit through the body, by the body, along with the body. Asceticism is not a reproof of the body, it is a response to love. And the first responsive act is to turn one's face unflinchingly against anything that would disorient this love. So when we're going to talk today about the Desert Fathers and Mothers, who give us a model for how you and I can live it, not as a model like to be like, oh, I could never achieve that. You know, I'm not as funny as Adam Sandler. I could never be a comedian. That's not what we're talking about. We're not saying we're setting idols to be like, I couldn't do that. What we're saying is we're seeing models of asceticism done properly, and we want to learn from that example. And clearly, what's being said here is that's a response to love. That's a free response to the one who calls for us. And we say, well, let me deny anything that removes my capacity to respond to him. This is like any human relationship, right? If a man or woman is held back from loving their significant other, their spouse, their fiance, whatever station of your relationship you're in, if there's something holding you back, a particular sin, a thing you like doing, the fact that you would prefer, I don't know, to hang out with the guys or the girls or whatever instead, you remove those things. You come to a point where it's like, it's me or that. And this is all we're doing in the ascetic strife, is to say, let's clarify, who is it that we love and why, and what are we going to do to find him? So we're going to start with St. Anthony. Because if I didn't start with him, Father Anthony Paul would eventually find out and tell me that I'm dumb. Because you know, every time he gives a talk, he'd be like, St. Anthony, the greatest saint. And I can't say anything to that. So St. Anthony is also the one who really, really kicks off this tradition. It's already started, right? It's not like asceticism, the way of living of Christians, took 290 years or so until Anthony the Great came and discovered it. It's that Anthony showed us a formula for how it can look like all the time. How somebody can live it in a systematic way. That's why he's great. This, by the way, is an iconic Western depiction. This isn't an Orthodox icon, not by any means. It doesn't follow the form in any way. But this is an iconic Western depiction of the temptation of Anthony. You see the demons plucking at him. One's got his head, the other's got like about to go for his beard, the one's got his feet, so on. And they're trying to dissuade him from his way of life. They're trying to take him away from his love. And you can find this in Old English books, because the temptation of Anthony is a cultural symbol, even in the West, who's completely atheistic now. But that's why I put this depiction, not because it's one of our icons or something. So Anthony is born a lot earlier than people realize. He's born in 251. He's born in an era where Christians are still persecuted. He's born at a time where it's not cool yet to be a Christian. And he lives an exceedingly long life. He dies in 356, right? Like Anthony was over 100 years old when he died. Anthony had seen the empire go from the persecution of Diocletian, by which we number the Coptic calendar, right, 284. He was already a man at that age. And he sees that, and he lives through Constantine, and he lives through the First Council, and he lives through the beginnings of Arianism, to the middle of the 4th century when Christianity started to rise, to become more ascendant. So he's a man who experienced this wide swath of the life of the church. And his story, most of us know something of. His parents die, they have a lot of land and money, and he's entrusted with the care of his sister. He goes to church one day, and he hears the gospel message, right? He is told, he thinks personally, right? God is speaking to him through the reading, go sell all that you have and follow me. He doubts this, another sign appears to him, hears the same thing, so on, and goes into the desert. The interesting thing about St. Anthony is that he doesn't actually go immediately to a cave by himself like we think. What St. Anthony actually did to start is he goes to the outskirts of the city, right? So he's in Alexandria. He goes to the outskirts of the city where there are already those who are living a somewhat secluded life. They dwell at the outskirts of a big major town, but they have, like, consider it like country living, right? They've got like a rural, like, homesteading thing going on, and they're like, we're going to just not be distracted. This is how we're going to live. Anthony starts that way. He doesn't have the presumption or the hubris to say, I'm just going to go do this. But he slowly gets called further and further out, and eventually he delves into the deepest part of the desert. Eventually, after his labor with God had already started, he goes to this. Now this proves to us two things. One, the ascetic life had already a mold that it fit. We already had people who lived around the towns that were participating in something like this. An undistracted life where it was somewhat removed from normal city goings on, and where people dedicated their life to prayer, fasting, ascetical work, so on. So Antony does this, and he only leaves the deepest part of the desert a couple of times. One of which is in 338, because one of his disciples, one of his sons, Saint Athanasius, who later writes his life, I brought a translation in case anybody wants to look at it, because I thought show and tell would make me seem more interesting. So this is a more modern translation of the life of Antony, which you can find online. But his biography is written by Saint Athanasius. Right? Saint Athanasius had plenty of opportunity to meet Antony in the desert, because every now and then the emperor, who could be Arian one day, Orthodox the next, would kick out Athanasius, exiling him 5 times in total between the various emperors, and he would be exiled into the desert. What does he do? He goes and hangs out with his Abba. Let me go hang out with Antony. And so he knows him personally, and he has this experience. And it's so much so that in 338, Antony actually says, I'm going to go out to Alexandria, and I'm going to clearly show that I'm with Athanasius. So the interesting thing is Saint Antony doesn't remove himself from the world and be like, I don't care what happens to the church. It can burn for all I care because I'm in the monastery. He doesn't say that. He in the desert sees himself ongoingly as a member of the body of Christ. He sees his vocation as to live as though he's living for his brothers and sisters, even though he's in the desert. So people who visit him, he greets them. People who ask him for a word, he gives if God grants. People who seek his advice, he gives. And eventually, he leaves his monastery, very, very, very infrequent. This isn't a big thing with him. And he goes and he says, okay, look, for what it's worth, I'm going to go and show the people that I'm with Athanasius on this, that the Arians are not doing things right. And eventually, he reposes. Within a year, St. Athanasius has written what's called the Life of Antony, the Vita Antoni. And it's famous, actually, in the West. The Life of Antony is considered to be one of the first real biographies that's written, where we get an idea of how did Antony live, what did he do, what was his walk with God like, and it becomes an example for many, many, many generations of people thereafter to be like, how am I going to live? Well, how should I order my life? And so they would just say, do like Antony. Read the Vita, read the life, and do like he did. This translation also has a copy of St. Athanasius' letter to Marcellinus on how to read the Psalms. Really great text. See, you have it. Go buy this book. Leave money after you take it for free. So Antony's a G. He starts his tradition. He goes to the desert after some training, and he goes and experiences what this life with God looks like. I'm going to read you a couple of texts from his life. The texts are small. I'm sorry. But bear with me, because it gives us a little bit of an idea of what Antony did, how he goes into the desert, how he came to this conclusion. So this is an icon that has Saint Serapion, who's a bishop, and then Antony, and then Abba Paul. Antony's in the middle. He's not dressed like a bishop. Only Serapion, who is a bishop, and then Abba Paul, the hermit, as well, is depicted. This is from the Red Sea, from St. Paul's monastery, because this is the start of a great tradition in the church. This is Abba Paul the hermit, the one that Antony went and visited, and you have the bird here that brings him the loaf, and he brought him to the day that Antony went to visit him. So here's the long quote. I know, groan. It's okay, I accept. It's my fault. I'm wrong. I'm going to read it as clearly as I can. So this is St. Athanasius saying, this is what Antony did, here's why, okay? So he said, I'm going to read from this side because it feels like I'm doing something fresh. He says, for there were not yet so many monasteries in Egypt, and no monk at all knew of the distant desert. Okay, so monk, by the way, monachos, is the one who's isolated. That's what the term means at the time. So there's nobody who lives on their own in the desert yet when Antony starts. But all who wished to give heed to themselves practiced the discipline in solitude near their own village. You already had groups of people who were like, let's separate ourselves a little bit to live a transformed life, to live a life where we can dedicate more time and effort to this. Okay? Now there was then in the next village an old man who had lived the life of a hermit from his youth up. Antony, after he had seen this man, imitated him in piety. So St. Anthony, contrary to some of our imagination of it, doesn't leave the church one day and be like, yo, the deepest part of the desert now. He goes and he's like, let me go see what this is about. If I'm gonna take this step, let me go learn from those who came before me. There's always discipleship with somebody like Antony, with somebody like Bohemios, with the Desert Fathers. They don't believe the idea that you can just go it alone, be like, yo, I'm inspired by God, let me go do this big, great thing. And at first, he began to abide in places outside the village. Then if he heard of a good man anywhere, like the prudent bee, like a bumblebee, that goes different places and collects stuff from wherever it goes. Like the prudent bee, he went forth and sought him, nor turned back to his own place until he had seen him. And he returned, having got from the good man, as it were, supplies for his journey in the way of virtue. So Anthony does these conferences. He goes to one village and he's like, yo, teach me what you know. Show me everything. And then he goes to another place, it's like, okay, I learned from this guy, show me something. And this is what he would do. This is how he would gain his experience. Thus conducting himself, Antony was beloved by all. He subjected himself in sincerity to the good men whom he visited, and learned thoroughly where each surpassed him in zeal and in discipline. He observed the graciousness of one, the unceasing prayer of another. He took knowledge of another's freedom from anger and another's loving kindness. He gave heed to one as he watched, to another as he studied. One he admired for his endurance, another for his fasting and sleeping on the ground. The meekness of one and the long-suffering of another he watched with care, while he took note of the piety towards Christ and the mutual love which animated all. Thus filled, he returned to his own place of discipline, and henceforth would strive to unite the qualities of each, and was eager to show in himself the virtues of all. So Antony doesn't go to the desert immediately. He goes to the outskirts, and he learns a little bit. And then he goes to each person that he thinks he can learn from, and he acquires the virtue that he needs from there. Now, this is interesting, because often what we're looking for, both in our spiritual lives and in people we like or we want to be mentored by or whatever, we want them to be everything, right? You'd be like, Antony learns that one of them is free from anger, the other guy is really loving. The other guy is patient, the other guy sleeps on the ground, the other guy does whatever. That means that he's not going and being like, yo, you're everything. That doesn't happen. There is none. It's only the Lord who's everything. And he's like, I'm attached, like my whole faith is based on you, which sometimes we do, right? We hear of a holy person, and then we hear about them getting mad, and we're like, I don't know if I can be Christian anymore. Because like Abuna Fulan, like one time yelled at someone. Or a scandal happened or something. Antony doesn't do that. He goes and seeks the wisdom from each person and says, how is it that I can unite the best of what each man has to offer in myself? How can I take the virtue of each one and make them all alive in me so that I can come nearer to Christ? It's another long quote. This is later in the life. He says, and so for nearly 20 years he continued training himself in solitude, never going forth, and but seldom seen by any. After this, when many were eager and wishful to imitate his discipline, and his acquaintances came and began to cast down and wrench off the door by force, Antony, as from a shrine, so at that point Antony hadn't seen anyone for years, okay? So he left, he goes to the outskirts, he leaves, he goes into the deeper part of the desert, nobody sees him, ever, right? And he says, then there were those who came and were like, we need to see Antony. We need to know what he's doing. We need to be like him. So this is the description that we get from what happens after years of people not seeing Antony. They wrench off the door by force. Antony, as though from a shrine, came forth initiated in the mysteries and filled with the Spirit of God. Then for the first time he was seen outside the fort by those who came to see him. And they, when they saw him, wondered at the sight, for he had the same habit of body as before. He didn't get fatter, he didn't get skinnier. And neither fat like a man without exercise, nor lean from fasting and striving with the demons. But he was just the same as they had known him before his retirement. And again, his soul was free from blemish, for it was neither contracted as if by grief, nor relaxed by pleasure, nor possessed by laughter or dejection. For he was not troubled when he beheld the crowd, nor overjoyed at being saluted by so many. But he altogether, even as being guided by reason and abiding in a natural state. Through him, the Lord healed the bodily ailments of many present, and cleansed others from evil spirits. And he gave grace to Antony in speaking, so that he consoled many who were sorrowful, and set those at variance at one. Like he reconciled people. Exhorting all to prefer the love of Christ before all that is in the world. And thus it happened in the end that cells arose even in the mountains, and the desert was colonized by monks. This is Athanasius' elaboration, who came forth from their own people and enrolled themselves for the citizenship in the heavens. I love this text from St. Athanasius because it's like so easy to read. You can be like, okay, yeah, cool, this happened, whatever, like let's move on. No, Antony is not like wasted away, right? Antony is not in the desert half dead because he rejects his body. Antony is also not in the desert indulging himself, right? I'm free, nobody can see me, let me live my life. Obviously, that wouldn't be befitting of him anyway. Antony is not one who comes out and is just like, whatever, like I don't care about you people. But he's also not one easily given to the compliments of others, right? A whole crowd is in front of him, and he's like, okay, cool, I'm in here with Jesus. I don't know what you people are doing. But like, we're all seeking the same thing. And that doesn't affect him at all, because he's completely grounded. Antony takes the royal middle way, right? He's not going to starve himself. He's not going to laud himself. He's not going to parade himself. He's going to be that guy who's somewhere in the middle, who says like, I'm pursuing Christ. I don't need to destroy my body to do it. The lesson, I think, for us from Antony's life in this case is to be like, we don't have to change the way we look necessarily, right? It doesn't have to be like I'm always like sad looking when I'm at work because I want people to know I'm grieving for my sin or something. It's not like I'm always going to be down and dejected and like looking at the ground, never cracking a joke because like now I'm like holier or ascetical or whatever, right? What Antony shows us is the pattern is not based on these external things, but in moderation and following the royal middle road, in not going overboard one way, whether the way of the good, fasting way too much, sleeping way too little, and not going overboard the other way, saying, well, we're free in Christ, we are. And therefore being like, okay, why fast, man? Jesus is good. He loves me. It's true. He does love you. But that's not the way. Antony shows us the middle ground. So the reason that I bring up one of the desert ammas, one of the desert mothers at this point, is because most people don't know this, but Athanasius wrote another life. And this is debated by scholars, so if you buy the book, it's like pseudo-Athanasius. But the tradition has it that Athanasius wrote another biography, this time of Syncletica. Okay? So one of the desert ammas is Syncletica, who also dwells at the edge of the city at first, and later probably goes out deeper. And St. Athanasius writes her life. She comes from a rich background. She has parents who have money and wealth and so on. And she also distributes the wealth of her parents. Her story and Antony's are fairly similar. There's a lot of shared elements. And right at the same time as St. Antony's story is written, Amma Syncletica's story is written also by Athanasius. Because this isn't a thing exclusive to men who go out into the desert. We have the story of lots of amazing men who go out into the desert, and we don't need to denigrate that. We also can't forget that this was a call for both men and women to live ascetical lives. The form this takes, even like St. Basil the Great, in some of his writing, has to affirm to be like, guys, like the bodies may be different, one of weaker composition, he means physically, and one of stronger, but the souls are of equal strength. He says in many cases women outdo the men in virtue. This is easy for him to say. This is complete blasphemy in the ancient world, right? The ancient world is guided by a thinking like Aristotle, who says like the woman is just an unformed man, right? She's like was gonna become a man, got stalled, became a woman, right? That's his like phylogeny of it all. It's not so much misogyny, he thinks it's just physiology, right? If you think that's misogynistic, whatever, it's up to you, but the point is he's not saying this because he hates women, that's just what he believes. A woman's a halfway formed dude. It's funny because, of course, biologically today we would be like, well, the base is female, and then if there's other stuff, you would develop into a male. But in that context, women are not seen to be of equal virtue to men, right? Women can't possibly come to a place of renunciation and asceticism and striving and fasting and so on as a man. But it's Athanasius himself, having written the life of Antony, who goes, here's the life of Syncletica. She does the same thing. And he probably purposely mentions the details about the parents who die and about distributing wealth to draw the mind of his hearer to be like, dude, I'm talking about the same call, the same thing. Men, women, everybody in the church is called to the same asceticism. And there's a couple of phrases, sayings of Saint Syncletica's that I love. So she says this is one of her sayings collected in the edition of the Desert Fathers, the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. It says, just as one cannot build a ship unless one has some nails, so it is impossible to be saved without humility. Beautiful. Here's my favorite. This is a saying I say to myself all the time. She says, many live on the mountains and behave as though they were living amidst the uproar of a city, and they are lost. It is possible while living amongst the crowd to be inwardly solitary, and while living alone to be inwardly beset by the crowd. I love this. Syncletica in the desert is able to be like, look, external circumstance is part of it, 100%. It's easier, there's less noise in many ways if you leave the noise. That's true. Because many have dwelt in the mountains and they live as though they're in the middle of an uproar. While many live in the midst of the city and they're in a complete serenity. Because Christ isn't about just being in a place. We're physical beings. Place affects us, right? It would feel weird to you to sit here and have a steak dinner in the church. Place matters. We know this. This is real. But at the same time, that circumstance doesn't have to be the dictating factor. So that Syncletica tells us that no matter where we live, whether in the mountains, whether in a cave, whether you're living at your workplace because you never leave and go home, whether in the middle of a city or in a country road, you can still find God if your soul finds peace. That's what she's saying. And I love her for that reason. She's one of the Desert Mothers who's earliest and who starts some of this tradition. And there's a few others as well. I wanted to talk to you about Pachomios too, because Antony starts a life of solitaries, right? Monachos, the word, means the solitary, the one who lives alone. Like monad is related to it. Saint Pachomios does something totally different. He goes, we're going to make a koinonia, a communion, a fellowship of monachoi. We're going to make a bunch of solitaries together. And it's a complete inversion because it doesn't make sense language-wise. But it's another form of the monastic life that, as we know, is very popular today. It's basically the way that most monks live. So he's born also fairly early, 292. He doesn't live nearly as long a life as Antony did, but long enough to have an impact. And his story of coming to Christianity is actually really interesting. He's born a pagan, okay? He doesn't know much about Christianity. Pachomios is not born like the pious parents and educated in the church books and so on. You know the sequence. That's not him. He gets drafted into the Roman army in 312, okay? The Roman army's on the move. It's always got people that it's got to beat up somewhere or people that are trying to attack it. He's drafted and he goes in. Somehow he lands in jail, right? The story is murky. Somehow he ends up in a prison, whether as a recruit or with an enemy or whatever. And this is what happens next. Initially, he and the other new recruits were locked up in a prison and sunk in deep affliction, tired, hungry, and frightened. That evening, some locals visited the prison and gave the young conscripts something to eat and drink. Pachomios was genuinely touched. Why are these people so good to us when they do not know us? His companions answered, they are Christians, and Christians are merciful to anyone, including strangers. That's it. This happens with Pachomios, and he's like, okay, cool. That thought stays with him. A time later, he's like, I'm becoming a Christian. This only makes sense. He ends up in the desert, and he ends up establishing the koinonia, the communion or the communal life of monastics that will be lived together in one harmony, but with your own like cell, coming together all the time for liturgy, for prayer, for things like that. That's started by him. And this is a model that somebody like St. Basil the Great, who we talked about last week, would follow and would actually push in his city. You guys, some of you remember we mentioned last week that Basil had a system of sending out monks 2 by 2 to go scour the city looking for people who were sick or afflicted. They would have been monks living in a koinonia, living in a communal setting, coming together to praise and to worship, and in this case, in Basil's setting, to work, to do things that were for the service of the whole body. This is just one of the icons that we have of him. This is him getting the monastic order given to him by an angel, because it would need to be an angel who tells him, go take a bunch of solitaries and make them live together, because it's a contradiction. So that's how the story goes. And he opens these monasteries in Tabanesi, part of the desert, not the same part as Kelia or the deep cells that Antony was in, but he gains renown for this. By the time that he's about to depart, there are 9 male monasteries under his control and 2 female monasteries. There are tons of people who go and flock to the desert under Pachomius because this is a way of life that makes sense to them. It's so much so that at some point, it's said about the desert that it became a city unto itself. That if you were the abbot of a monastery, you had more people under your tutelage than in a big city in Cappadocia or in Egypt. But this is the move of people, if you're paying attention to the time, who are now living in the era where Christianity is legal and eventually gains the ascendancy. Martyrdom was the way of Christian life to begin with, right? Everybody knew that at some point, in some way, whether just social ostracization or actually giving your life, martyria, witness, was the model. That's what you're going to do, right? That's the whole pattern. Eventually, Christianity becomes popular, right? Gains the ascendancy. And now people look for renewed ways to be like, how can we witness to the life in Christ? What is the way that we can offer ourselves completely to God? How can we do this? And the desert becomes one of the, not replacement, but one of the alternate ways that it's like, well, if we're not going to offer our lives to Him, we can certainly offer our own freedom in the desert and render Him everything we are, right? To go and to give everything to Him in this place. And so that's why at some point the deserts become so full that they look like cities, right? The place where originally nothing dwelt. Now, there's an interesting aside, and then we're going to keep moving because we have lots of people to talk about. There's an interesting image that really I think most people don't realize about the desert. But do you know what Egypt represents biblically? Some of you have heard me say this. If you've heard me say it, don't say it. What does Egypt represent in the Bible? Is it a happy place? What did you say? Slavery. Egypt is the land of slavery and sin and death. Your forefathers died there. The Israelites were enslaved there. The children are killed there. It's the land of sin, death, corruption. Every bad thing comes out of Egypt, biblically speaking. You know, Babylon, Egypt, these are images of evil. Pharaoh is an image of the devil who enslaves through his sinful means, right? The desert itself, biblically speaking, also represents the place which is the dwelling of the demons, the place of chaos, the place of disorder, the place of sin. So there's this really interesting part of the tradition that we don't realize, where it's like, it's not accidental that the monks went out into the desert of Egypt. There's desert all over the place in the Middle East, by the way. Like they didn't go to the desert of Saudi Arabia, which wasn't bad at the time, but you know my point. There's some sort of symbolic pattern to this which says that when the monastics go out to live the life in Christ, they go to the deepest, darkest place as Christ descends into hell, right? And they go and colonize it for Him. The desert of Egypt, the most arid, monstrous place of the place of death, and they go there and they say, this is now Christ's. And that's a symbol really to us of maybe the depth of the human heart that has to be conquered for Christ. They do this physically, right? They go and live in the desert, which is the place of sin and death and destruction and monsters and so on. Antony's beaten up by monsters. The message for us is not just to go into the desert, but to go into the deepest part of our heart, to go into the deepest recess where we allow the beasts to dwell and to cast them out, right? That's what the ascetical tradition is there to show us. Because it's cool. If one of you wants to be a monk, great. Fantastic. I think marriage is the better call. I'm biased. And by better, I mean higher, but that's unbiased. But at the same time, even if you don't go into the desert, the call to conquer the recesses of your heart so that Christ can go and take that place for his own is the same call. That's what the monks show us. That's what the nuns show us. That's what everybody in this tradition is teaching us. Now another big player is Macarius the Great. Macarius the Great is one of the greatest men of the desert. He has international reputation. He teaches so many things. And he has this famous text, also show and tell, that are his 50 homilies. Some of you did this with Abuna John some time ago, and his great letter. Now you'll notice the scholars got to this, unfortunately, and titled it Pseudo-Macarius, because they're like, we don't know which Macarius wrote it. The church tradition has it that Macarius the Great wrote it, so like as far as I'm concerned, it's Macarius the Great. These are homilies that have been read for 1600 years in the church. It's not pseudo anything, okay? Eliminate this from your mind. When I was young and picked up this book for the first time, I was like, oh, it's a fake, I can't read it, it's not true, it's baloney, okay? Buy the book. If you have it in the church, give money and then take the book. I'll show you how many notes I have in this text later if you want. But Macarius is one of the early desert monastics. He's one of the early men in the desert as well. He lives in 295 to 392. He's also one of these guys who lives forever. You know, there's something about the great monastics and their longevity, even though they did things that don't make sense, you know, for your health, right? Like sleep 8 hours, whatever. We have some people in the room who don't sleep 5 hours probably, because I know their careers have them bound up in that. But they do all these things and yet they live this fullness. It's really interesting. I wanted to share with you a couple quotes from Macarius to try to convince you to pick up the book, because Macarius is a G as well. And this is a text that we have like either from his pen or from a recording of somebody writing down his homily. Here's a text that surprised me when I read it because I didn't expect it from Macarius. Not because I knew anything of him. I didn't expect it because I thought, oh, he's a monastic. His whole emphasis is going to always be on prayer. Pray, 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 pray. Don't do anything else, pray, right? And like, I'm impious. That's hard for me to swallow. So I love this text because look at how honest he is about what life and community can look like with the brethren. He says, the brethren, therefore, regardless of what work they are doing, ought to conduct themselves toward each other in love and in cheerfulness. And the one who works should say of him who is praying, I also possess the treasure which my brother possesses, since it is common. And let him who prays say of him who reads, what he gains from reading redounds also to my advantage. And he who works, let him say, the work which I am doing is done for the common good. For as the members of the body being many are one body, and help each other while each still performs its own function, as the eye sees for the body, and the hand labors for all the members, and the foot walks, sustaining all the members, and another member suffers with the others, so also the brethren should be among themselves. Thus, he who prays should not judge the one working, because he's not praying. Neither should he who works condemn the one praying, because he's resting while he himself is at work. Neither should he who is serving condemn another, but let each one do whatever he is doing for the glory of God. He who reads should regard the one praying with love and joy, with the thought, for me he is praying. And let him who prays consider what the one working is doing as done for the common good. I love this text. I figure, I'm reading Macarius the Great, the man is said to have slept for a few minutes leaning against the wall each day, at most, right? And here's a guy who says like, look, if you have a gift, do it. If your gift is to work physically, right, to labor for the monastery, do it. And think of your work as happening for the body. And the one who prays, who probably most of us at least would pay lip service to being like, yo, that guy's like the holy one. Like he's the one actually doing the real Jesus stuff. It's like, look at him and say he's praying for me, and that guy should look at you and be like, thank God he labors for me. Right? That's how a body works. Some of us have the gift of visiting the poor. Some of us have a gift of speaking to others and knowing their pain and sitting with them. Some of us have a gift of organizing soccer tournaments, right? Some of us know how to cook and can cook for the brethren. Whatever. He says all of this should be considered as communal, so that we're all seen as laboring in this labor together. So that if you start to read and think, I'm so smart and lofty and the people don't get it because I'm smarter than them and I really know the secrets of Jesus, no, you learn that stuff for him and for them. You learn that stuff so that you can render it to your brethren. Okay? Does that make sense? I really, this quote kills me because I just, like I say, I'd never expect it from a guy who was known to pray many, many, many hours in a day. But here's Macarius saying this is what a body looks like. And it's very real. The guy who prays probably was like, yo, that guy's not holy, look at him. And the guy who works was like, bro, pick up one of the potato sacks, or hamni, do your job. But that's not how we're supposed to see it. That's not how we're to see each other. This one's smaller, so don't judge, okay? This is a text that actually can be read on one slide, even by you people, okay? I know I'm close, and I can read them all because I'm super close, but even Michael back there can see this, okay? I'll take applause at the end, thank you, for the for the one slide. I love this text because of the imagery, because of the gentleness of it. And again, all I'm doing is throwing out people and names at you and giving you some context. If you hear or think about something they said, you can often be like, I like that Macarius guy. Let me think about him more or read him more or whatever. So St. Macarius says about those who believe that maybe they were without hope, that God couldn't help them, that they've tried everything in trying to get away from sin, and it's like, no, I'm hopeless. I'm done for, man. God can't do anything with me. He says this, it is not true, as some maintain who are led astray by error, that the human being is irremediably dead and can no longer do anything good. A small child is incapable of anything. It cannot run to its mother on its own legs. It tumbles on the ground. It cries out, sobs, and calls out to her. So that's the image for humanity, right? A young child is useless. Doesn't actually pick itself up and be like, yo, mom, I need some help, right? It tries, it stumbles, it falls on the ground, hits its face, starts crying. This is us in the spiritual life. You've all felt this. You've all definitely fallen flat on your face in the spiritual life. We all experience this all the time. And he says, and she is gentle with it. She is touched to see her baby seeking her so impatiently with so many sobs. It cannot reach her, but it cries out to her tirelessly, and she goes to it, overcome with love. She kisses it, she presses it to her heart, and feeds it with unspeakable tenderness. God loves us, and he behaves like her towards the soul that seeks him and cries out to him. In the eagerness of that infinite love that is his, he takes hold of our spirit, unites himself to it, and we become one spirit with him, as the apostle says. The soul is linked with the Lord, and the Lord, full of compassion and love, unites himself to it, and it dwells in his grace. Then the soul and the Lord are one spiritually. They form one life and one heart. I love this. It's this is the most poignant image ever. Because, wait till all of you have children too, right? My son, for example, will do things, and I will do it behind his back, performing the whole work, and I'll let him finish it. And he'll be like, look, Daddy, what I did. And I look at him and I want to laugh. And then I look and I want to be like, that's exactly what I do with God. You see this work I just accomplished on your behalf, buddy? And he's walked me the whole way with training wheels, right? This is a beautiful image, I think, of what Macarius really sees the spiritual life is like. He's so in love with God that he says, look, listen, man, no matter how pathetic you are, no matter how many times you're going to fall on your face, no matter how broken you may be, this is what he does. No woman leaves her sobbing child and it's like, look, pathetic runt. What's wrong with you? Get up, to a 6-month-old or something. No woman would do that, he says, and therefore we know no God would do that, of ours anyway. God isn't like that. He doesn't behave that way towards us. But if we make any movement towards him, he finishes the work, he accomplishes the work, and he lets us think that we have some credit for it. And this is very characteristic of St. Macarius, which is why I thought I'd share this particular passage of his. Now I want to give you an idea as to where we've gotten in time, so I can tell you about some of the systematizers. Some of the people who are like, okay, we've been doing this desert thing for a while, let me tell you what the desert's like. So we have Athanasius and Antony here at the top, Pachomius overlaps, and Macarius also overlaps this, okay? You can't really see my pointer anymore, but in this area. And now we're going to go to Evagrius and John Cassian, who are just at the end of the life of Antony and Pachomius. Evagrius and John Cassian are two of the Desert Fathers who go and they're like, let's put this together. Let's make some sort of system and be like, this is what's being taught. I'm going to filter it down so that other people who aren't here, who aren't with Antony, who didn't get to meet the great man, can learn from his system. Now, all of you will know I love Evagrius. If you don't know that, you'll know it soon. Evagrius is great. He's one of the greatest. And he's so interesting, given the time period he lives in, 345 to 399. And he also has a really great pedigree. He's ordained a reader by Basil the Great. He's ordained a deacon by Gregory the Theologian. Right? He's in with the all-stars, you know? Like the high class, in a sense, of the Christian church. Evagrius is so cool because he's so real. Because at some point, as a deacon in the great city of Constantinople, he and a royal woman, he and a noble woman, are in this love affair. Not physically, nothing happens between them as far as we know, but they're about to. They're going to run away together. They're going to have a new life. They're exchanging letters. It's heated. You know, it's like a cheesy chick flick in the ancient world. Evagrius is a deacon, right? A deacon at a time where like this is a real thing. Sorry for anybody who puts on a vestment today. But like actually he carries out duties in the city of Constantinople representing the church. This is complete scandal if it's found out that Evagrius is about to go sleep with a royal woman, right? And also it's his head, like he's dead, khalas, if that happens, right? And Evagrius one day has a dream, and in the dream he knows he's in prison. He knows he's going to be punished for something he's done. And then he hears the guy ahead of him who's being interrogated. Think of like the movies where you've got the holding cell and the guy in the room and you hear the one guy screaming. The guy ahead of him is being tortured for whatever he's done. And Evagrius goes, I'm next. And I know what happened. I know why this is happening to me. It's because of this love affair. I get it. I know why it's happening. And an angel comes to him in the dream. An angel comes to him and goes, my lord Deacon Evagrius, just to humiliate him, by the way. Like he's in prison about to be punished for having an affair. And the angel apparently goes, my lord Deacon Evagrius. Sayyidna, right? Like we would address a bishop. What has you in this place? Right? And Evagrius is like, I'm just checking out the neighborhood, you know, visiting. But Evagrius says, my sin brought me here. Let me out of this place, and I promise you I will leave the city. I will leave Constantinople today. Only grant me 2 days that I might pack my clothes. Nobody in the ancient world would have ever had so many clothes that they needed 2 whole days to pack them. So we know, and Evagrius says this about himself, he dealt with vainglory because he really liked to look good, to look flashy. And so the angel goes, fine, 2 days it is. And he wakes up and he goes, okay, that was a dream. Any vow taken in a dream is a vow taken to the Lord. Whatever. If I vowed to the Lord, it's real. I have to go do this. And so he takes his 2 days to pack his clothes. It's funny, in the Greek versions of this, he takes 1 day to pack his clothes. In the Coptic, because the Coptic is very, very, very monastic, it's like he took 2 whole days to pack his clothes. And I just find that really funny about the tradition. But he repents, and he packs all of his clothes, and he goes to join one of the desert ammas, Saint Melania. Saint Melania dwells at the place called the Mount of Olives, right? The place where, like in the scripture, where the Lord went. There's a monastery there, and she has a community there. And he goes to seek her and Rufinus, who have a monastic dwelling in that place. And for a time, he's good. He goes under Melania's wing. She becomes one who instructs him and tells him this is what you're going to do. And it's said that Evagrius does well for a few days, and then he starts to talk a little bit flashy. He starts to put on some of the more extravagant outfits that he had, become a little bit more flashy in his dress, and he falls back into his vainglory. The fact that Evagrius is an educated, smart man from pedigree, his father was a bishop, by the way, he gets back into that habit of vainglory. And then he becomes sick with a fever. And doctors come and treat him and so on, and it doesn't work. And Melania goes to him and goes, my son, there is something divine about this illness. You need to get out of here. And so she does. She tells him, you need to go deeper. And eventually, Evagrius makes it out all the way into the desert cells of what's called Kelia, which is the deepest part of the desert that very few people ever actually venture to. First he goes to the outpost that's right outside it, and then he goes into the heart of it. And Evagrius would eventually repent of his sin, having said that Melania was the major influence that led to this. First the dream, then Melania, and then finally he makes his way out into the desert. And he's one of the desert, not reformers, systematizers. He's one of the fathers who goes, after learning from all of the people who've come before us, and Macarius the Great is one of his abbas, here is a basic way of understanding what it is that ails human beings. It's said that Evagrius would spend as much time with the brethren as they needed, that he would spend hours with them if they wanted, and because of this, he became a very perceptive interpreter of the human soul. What today would be called a psychologist, but that would be to reduce him, lil asaf. So we're not going to call him that. Sorry for the psychologists in the room. But Evagrius becomes this keen interpreter of the human soul and all its faculties, and he says, you know what? After a time in the desert, what I've realized is that no matter what sin you're tempted by, it can be broken down into one of 8 basic thoughts. No matter how complicated, I was like doing this while crossing the road, while saving an old woman, while swearing, while not wearing my one shoe. He's like, it doesn't matter how complicated you want to make it. It doesn't matter how many dressings you want to give the situation. If you break it down enough, you'll find that it comes down to one of 8 basic thoughts that tempt a human being. This system of 8, I know Father John covered with you guys quite some time ago, and you guys did a bit of a series on it. So some of you have heard it, some of you haven't. But it's the source of much of the later tradition. Even people who didn't like Evagrius would use his system of 8 sins to understand the spiritual life. He becomes one of the great spirit bearers of the tradition, even to those who never knew him. Because everybody would understand things along his terms. Even today, modern Catholics with the system of 7 deadly sins is based on the 8 generic thoughts. It's altered a little, but the basic frame is the 8. A couple things are taken out, one thing is put in, and it's like, okay, now you have 7 deadly sins. That's a whole topic unto itself. Many of you have heard me speak for 2 hours just about the 8 thoughts, and I'm not going to do that today. But I thought I'd give you a taste of some of the things that Evagrius is known for doing. So in his exhortation to the monastics, he tells us that the goal of the spiritual life is to see clearly, that the reason that you want to put off the 8 passions, the 8 thoughts, is to be able to interpret properly what reality looks like and what your place in it is, and so on and so forth. And so he says, just as it is impossible to see one's own image in water that has been disturbed, if you shake up the water, so too the mind will not be able to see the Lord as in a mirror without having set right its interior state, and without having purified the soul of passionate attachments to material things. As it is impossible to build a tower without a skilled workman, so it is impossible to acquire the wisdom of God without warfare, and impossible to conduct the warfare successfully without prudence, and impossible to find prudence without yearning and zeal for the divine. Just as it is impossible for a tree to produce fruit unless it has remained for a while in the earth with rain to water it, so too a man will not produce the perfect fruit of righteousness unless he has borne patiently with afflictions and trials for the sake of the truth. So again, Evagrius situates us. He says, if you want to see God clearly in your mind's eye, you have to take away the garbage that removes your ability to see. The basic point about the desert that most of us don't know today, that most of us don't intuitively realize, is for the desert, you and I are basically made for good. Our nature is good by nature, and virtue is the normal state. To err is human, to sin is human. These are thoughts that are alien to the desert. It'd be like, no. To virtue is human. To sin is subhuman. And Evagrius is one of the great expositors of this. He says, if you want to see God, you'll see Him. Take off all the garbage that you've accumulated on your soul. He's also famous for having elaborated a slide which we're not going to read because it's really cool and we don't have time and it's really long and you're all going to groan. He's famous, and especially in modern circles, for telling us about this particular deadly thought, this particular sin that takes hold of the modern age called acedia. If you've ever heard me speak, you've heard me talk about acedia. I know, I'm repetitive. Acedia is, I would argue, at the heart of much modern dejection and boredom and despair and idleness. And Evagrius elaborates about what it is in the 4th century. If you really want to know the modern condition, read about Acedia and Evagrius. There's another good book written by a guy, Bungay, on Evagrius as Acedia. I will give you the book recommendation if you want. We're not going to read this slide. Don't judge me. Don't judge me. The last person that we're going to talk about today is St. John Cassian. John Cassian is also later, 360 to 435. So John Cassian's really interesting because what he does is he comes from the West, right, where modern day Hungary, Romania is. This map is really old. If you see it, actually has Yugoslavia still on it, but it's the best I could find for his journey. He comes from what is known as the Latin-speaking region of the time, and he journeys all the way down to Egypt, only to go back and end up all the way in France, in Marseille, France, so that he could bring true, authentic monasticism to the West. That was his goal. He's like, yo, him and his buddy, let's go find out what really like ascetical life looks like in its authenticity. Where do you learn authentically? Egypt, right? The land of sin and slavery that's been now transformed into the house of holiness. Let's go there. Let's go and sit with the monks. And the most interesting thing about John Cassian, he also copies Evagrius, by the way. Like, so he writes about the 8 thoughts and so on, whatever. Everybody copies Evagrius after. Evagrius is about, whatever, anyway. He does this where he and his buddy would sit down with the monks and be like, yo, tell us about the spiritual life. And so there's a series of books of his called The Conferences, where it's him and his friend being like, yo, how do we be holy? Like, why is it that sexual sin is so hard? Why doesn't God make me patient? Like, questions that you're like, wait, a monastic asked this? They're so pedestrian that reading Conferences very much is like, wow, like this is really speaking to me. I feel what this guy is asking. I wanted to give you guys a few examples. So Cassian asks, what is the goal and the end of being a monk? The guy's a monk. He's been a monk for years. And they go and sit with Abba Moses, who's probably our Moses the Strong. We don't know definitively, but he's probably that Moses. And he's like, bro, what's this about? Like, why be a monk? He's wearing monastic garb. He's traveled hundreds of kilometers on foot to meet monks, and he's like, why do this? It's like you and I being like, why be a Christian? It's that pedestrian, and I love the Conferences for it. That's where it starts. It builds up a little bit, but if you read Conferences, there's a lot of like, man, I feel this guy. Like, I've been there. I have that question today too. So Moses says to them, as I said, the farmer who has for his aim to live free from care and with plenty, while his crops are springing up, has this as his immediate object and goal. So he says, in Christianity, you have to have an immediate goal and an end goal, right? And he actually is very clear. Cassian's very funny. It's like most of us want to be like, yo, like salvation, like that's the goal. And they ask this earlier in the conference. And then they're like, that's cool and cute, Moses. But like seriously though, like what do I do tomorrow? You know, like it's nice that you want me to be saved. But how can I do that like now? When like that whole thing is a big thing. So this is why he gives this example. He's like, if a farmer's goal is to have his field be plentiful, he also has to have a first goal, a goal that he applies himself to today. So he says, his immediate object and goal, vis-a-vis, to keep his field clear from all brambles and weeds, and he does not fancy that he can otherwise ensure wealth and a peaceful end unless he secures by some plan of work and hope that which he is anxious to obtain. The end of our profession, indeed, as I said, is the kingdom of God. So that's your like, whatever, end goal. Call it your 10-year plan. I hate that kind of phrasing, but whatever. The end of our profession is the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. But the immediate aim or goal is purity of heart, without which no one can gain that end. Fixing our gaze then steadily on this goal, as on a definite mark, let us direct our course as straight towards it as possible. And if our thoughts wander somewhat from this, let us revert our gaze upon it, and check them accurately as by a sure standard, which will always bring back all our efforts to this one mark, and will show at once if our mind has wandered ever so little from that direction marked out for it. So it says, to have a pure heart is your proximal goal. How you do that today will very much depend on like your particular disposition. Are you tempted by envy? Are you tempted by vainglory, whatever, so on and so forth. But it's like such a pedestrian way to start a dialogue. These guys have traveled thousands of kilometers and like, why be a monk? Okay, cool, like that's the, you know, like that's the Jesus whatever answer, but like how do I do it? And that's how this whole dialogue goes. Then, I love this, the question that comes shortly after, and I paraphrase, is literally like, my mind wanders a lot. Is it possible to stop the thoughts from assailing me? That's the next question. From 2 monks, asking another monk. Be like, I'm distracted when I pray. That's how like baseline we're talking. And the conferences are a real hoot for this reason, because you read it and you're like, these guys, like, I mean, bro, like they're more impious than me. You know, like they're not. But you might feel like that reading the text at times. And basically, the answer also from Moses is something along the lines that, like, you can't stop thoughts from coming. That's a fact of life. Whether, this is my paraphrasing, whether you get a thought or not is like as much under your control as if it rains. You have no way to control that. What you can do is to direct the thought, or to use it, or to dismiss it. But if you're distracted, thoughts constantly come to you, you have to labor in the art of dismissing and working on that. Because you can't ever live a life without thoughts. That's his answer, basically. This is a good place to end. Actually, before I end, before I read this quote, one of the things that's really interesting about Cassian, one of his quotes that I wanted to share, but I didn't want to have so many slides that people died on me in the middle, is Cassian. Actually, Cassian and Climacus, 2 of the fathers that write this, are very clear. By the time the desert tradition gets to them, there are those that would have started to follow it to be like, yo, if I fast hard enough, I'll be holy. And Cassian actually says, look, seriously, the demon says, I don't sleep. You don't sleep? I don't sleep. You fast? I don't eat. You pray and you're reverent before God? I know He exists. I've known He existed before you were alive. But all of these things accomplish nothing if seen as goals in and of themselves, because the outward form isn't the point of asceticism. He says if these aren't tools utilized to come to a relationship with God, to the living God with whom we're made for union, then these things are pointless. And this is Cassian summarizing some of the desert, because people would have come at that point to be like, yo, if I just do the same thing the holy guy does, I'm good. Right? And sometimes we're besieged by that, especially as Orthodox Christians. You'd be like, I fasted Lent, man. There should be progress in my life. You know, I even did the first week, the preparation week. You know, but that's not the way this works. It's not about externality. It's all about the internal response to love, which is why that's where we started. This is a good place to end talking about Cassian and talking about the desert. Cassian tells us in the goal in the spiritual life and what we're pursuing, he says, for then we'll be perfectly fulfilled in our case that prayer of our Savior, in which He prayed for His disciples to the Father, saying, that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and they in us, and again that they may be one as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us. When that perfect love of God, with which He first loved us, has passed into the feelings of our heart as well, by the fulfillment of this prayer of the Lord, which we believe cannot possibly be ineffectual. And this will come to pass when God shall be all our love, and every desire, and every wish and effort, every thought of ours, and all our life and words and breath, and that unity which already exists between the Father and the Son and the Father has been shed abroad in our hearts and minds, so that as He loves us with a pure and unfeigned and indissoluble love, so we also may be joined to Him by a lasting and inseparable affection, since we are so united to Him, that whatever we breathe or think or speak is God. That's the point of asceticism, right? It's not to torture yourself. It's not to make sure your body withers away so it's weak physically. It's not any of these things. It's to come to this, to come to union with Him, so that the things that stop our union with Him can be removed from our path. And I think it's so cool that somebody like John Cassian, who goes and is like, I'm going to gather up all the wisdom of Egypt into one book, the Conferences. This is one of his texts, like that. He's like, this is what spiritual life looks like. This is what we're being called to. And so I wanted to end with that, to be like, to bring us back to the point of saying, if we want to read the desert, if we want to look at what Pachomius was doing in his communion, in his koinonia, if we want to look at Macarius the Great's homilies, Antony the Great, all of the desert wisdom that still exists, we have to remember that all of this stuff is done not as self-help, not as self-improvement, right? That wasn't as big then. It's huge now. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. But it's done so that we can remove the obstacles that scrape away at our relationship with God, that undermine our capacity for love. And that's why any of this is done. That's why we fast. That's why we sing long hymns. That's why we stand. That's why we serve. That's why we may sleep less. Again, like none of it about physical torture, but about being able to come to Him freely. Any thoughts about any of this? Questions, comments? Something you heard before that's maybe like a good addition? You were going to raise your hand. Go ahead, answer. So there are texts about what monasticism is, what the call looks like for some people, that kind of thing. But as far as I know, there's no good particular guide to being like, what are the things that you'll see or do or know, whatever, to indicate that you should be a monastic, or that you have to be a monastic, or this kind of thing. I think that the reason this one answer doesn't exist is because it was always done in some form of discipleship. Like, you discern with your Abba, I have this call, I feel this call. This thing seems to me like it's the way that God intends for me to live. And then it's like, test it, try living like it. Visit a monastery. Something actually Father Anthony Paul is very big on. He points out that monasteries have their own culture. So like, for example, you get monasteries that are much more like work focused, that are a little bit more solemn all the time. Their style is that. They don't smile as much. They work a lot. They whatever. And then you have like Antonian monks, which Father Anthony Paul, of course, sees himself most aligned with. He's the closest monastic I know. It's why I'm citing him. But like he'll say, like, you know, the monastics at Antony's monastery like play practical jokes on each other. Like I heard him once say about how some monastic like to read the names of all the departed on Leilat Abu Ghadam Sis, which is already a ridiculously long day. And so like they decided one day that amidst the massive catalog of names that he was going to sing and do with a tune, they included his mother's name, and she wasn't dead. Now, like, this would be this. Like, if somebody did this today in church, we'd all be scandalized. If this happened here, you guys would all be like, yo, you can't do that. But like, that's its own culture. Like, that's something that is unique to that particular group. And so I know that there's a sense in which it's like, go there, spend time, try, see what you're called to. The monastics might invite you. You might sit with an Abba and hear a word that you needed to hear to go back into the world. You might hear something where you're like, oh, okay, this really isn't for me. But it's about trying, apparently. I don't know. I have no experience of that. And it's about discernment with some guidance, really, more than anything else, to be like, how do you know it's you or not? I think one of the reasons also the fathers don't talk a lot about it is because very much like the calling is the same whether lived monastically or in the world, right? The ascetical call, the call to renunciation, is the same here as it is in the desert. It's just manifested differently. And so if you're called to the same work, there may not be a simple way to be like, oh, if this happens to you, then you know you're supposed to be monastic. But you're supposed to live that life here or there. Thoughts? Comments? Questions? This is our last week together. So if there was something about the other weeks you wanted to discuss, we could too. Obviously, we don't have to trap people. We can get going too, but I'm happy to go as long as you guys want. I stopped early, man. I didn't even hit 10. You all people were late, by the way, but and whatever.
Why don't we have
There's not going to be Q&A till 10, don't worry. We can do Q&A, and then when it dies, we'll pray. Somebody here had their hand up. Oh, it was here? Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, why do you dislike, psychology? No, I'm actually wondering. What's up?
I think that the modern psychological enterprise is an interesting hybridization of empirical method, where there's nothing empirical to be measured, and a hubristic attempt to say that you know something about the human soul or the human reality that you can't know without a deeper insight into what a human being is. I think for a long time, the only access somebody had to the inner life was to say that they were a spiritual person, and therefore the spiritual worldview that they have gave them a guide to understanding the inner depths of a human being. Today, we claim to understand the depths of a human being without any particular spiritual worldview, without a view other than materialism. You're a hunk of cells that have some chemicals that hit each other at a particular rate. And I think anything claiming to be the study of the soul, which is what the psychologia would be, or the healing of the soul, psychotherapy, psychotherapeutai, anything claiming that is hubristic outside of a worldview that actually says, here we can say something about what a human being really is. In an atheistic frame that says, like, we don't know that there's any goal for a human being, we don't know that there's any depth, we don't know that there's any meaning to human being, I think it's excessively bold to say, like, but we know what motivates them and what drives them and how they respond, and we can predict all of these things about them. So I think when psychology is really born in the 1800s, particularly under somebody like William James, it opens the door to all of the self-help literature, to the fact that we talk so much about our inner lives as though we have an understanding of what's going to bring peace. And that's where I think the modern world struggles, thinking that it's like, I'm going to find meaning in this, but I would argue you can't find meaning unless you're going to ground it in something real. And it's not real to be like, we live, we die, we're like chunks of meat with brains, and like we move on. So that's probably why I take so many jabs at the enterprise. That's a long-winded version of an answer. I don't know if that helps in any way, but I can tell you more if you want. Am I on camera?
Yeah.
Am I actually?
Yeah.
Why didn't you tell me?
So you can say something.
Let's edit that.
Yeah, probably. It's on touch.
I actually thought it was on, because I looked at this thing and I'm like, I wonder if that's the camera.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Good to know. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the past 4 weeks, for someone who knows nothing about the text, is very overwhelming.
Yes.
Where should I start?
See, I think the beauty of the tradition, and everybody who's ever asked me this knows this, so some of you have heard me say this, but I think the beauty of the tradition is that Christianity is an all-encompassing worldview that says, here's what life means. And I think what that means is that the person who's interested in art can start with something that is not the person who's interested in liturgy. And the person who's interested in liturgy is not going to start at the same point who's interested in history, which is sort of like more my orientation. And the person who's more philosophically minded is going to start at a different place than these guys. So like, when I started reading the Church Fathers, I happened on the Apostolic Fathers. And I was like, you can't be real right now. There are people who sat with the disciples, and to me, it was wild. I'm like, okay. I don't care what anybody says, like in the modern age and whatever. If I can find out that there's a guy who sat with John and knows what John meant in his gospel, which is the more challenging of the gospels, I got it. I know the answers. And that was cool to me, because I was historically minded. I had this notion that, like, if it's closer to the source, it means something. Then somebody might say, like, well, I really love serving the poor. Well, like, the fathers talk tons about what love of the poor looks like and the renunciation of wealth and so on. Some people might start with that and be like, wow, like these guys really gave me a theological frame for the fact that I love going to service. Somebody might say they love liturgy, right? And then you have fathers who talk about what it looks like to live liturgy constantly. The way we formulate liturgy, of course, is a little bit different, but there's avenues to all of these things. If people ask me, the most straightforward, simple texts that are early and that I think is accessible to anybody is the Apostolic Fathers. Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, Polycarp of Smyrna. These guys are, I think, easy, accessible. There's fresh translations of their work. So I think it's a really good place to start. But if you had a specific interest, start there. And then you're going to get all this stuff you don't understand, right? If you're starting the church fathers, you're going to be like, wait. They mention this heresy here, and that historical thing there, and that whatever, and that's okay. Stick with it, like as if the first time you read a scientific paper or a paper about sociology or something. There's all this like theory, and this guy said that, and this person, and this many years ago we found this out, and you're going to be like, I don't get it. But if you kept reading the literature, you'd eventually be like, oh, I acquired the language, like I started to get it. And I think reading the desert's like that. Reading the history is like that. There's a bunch of stuff that you're going to read the first time, be like, okay, I don't know who this heretic is. I don't even know why he's insulting him. And it's just something that I think you have to stick with, and being knee deep in means that eventually you'll gain the language. Yeah?
So I can tell that very much when we were researching the books, there was some language like pseudo, not pseudo, authentic. Like, can you speak more to that? So like current search or literature, what are some tips and tricks that we can do that people who do it is like more, or like that it's actually the authentic thing, like what to do, what not to do.
There are libraries online. So the Fathers were first translated into English in a massive project by a bunch of Anglicans. The Anglican Church was trying to gain authority in the English-speaking literature world to be like, yo, we're cool too. Because of course everybody knew the Protestants, everybody knew the Catholics. The Anglicans are sort of in between. And so they did this translation in the late 1800s, the 1890s, of 38 volumes of the Church Fathers. 10 volumes of Fathers pre-Nicaea, 38 post-Nicaea or Nicaean time. That's called, by the way, Ante-Nicaean, A-N-T-E. Everybody gets confused and be like, why are they against Nicaea? It's not anti means predating, like antecedent. But anyway, there's like that, which is freely available online. Hard to read because it's not as like, it's not modern English, it's 1890. This one I struggle with, like if it has a name you recognize, like Cyril the Pillar of the Faith, like Athanasius the Apostolic, like Gregory the Theologian, you're probably cool. Like read that. The only rule of thumb that I've ever heard that I'm like, oh, that works every time, although you'd miss a lot of a lot of text this way, would be like Abuna Athanasius in Kitchener was big on being like, look, at some point Abuna says the absolution of the servants, and he lists a number of saints from the mouth of this saint, this saint, this saint, this saint. His rule of thumb was like, if you don't know anything about anything, pick somebody from the absolution, read them. So Chrysostom's in there, Basil the Great's in there, Athanasius is in there. Like pick one of them and read their text, and you'll be safe. And it's true. There's a ton of stuff that's not in there. Like the Apostolic Fathers all don't make it. Like Ignatius is cool, but he doesn't make it. Irenaeus of Lyon is cool, but he doesn't make it. But you won't read anything where you're like, how do I know if Tertullian is cool or not? He's not cool, by the way, but whatever. He's cool if you want to know history. He's not cool if you want like Orthodox teaching. He dies as part of the Montanist heresy. Tertullian, the Latin writer. But you won't go astray if you're going by the absolution. If you want that as a simple and pure rule. If you're in doubt, ask your Abba, right? Ask your father, ask Abuna John. Right? Abuna John pretends like he doesn't read books, but he does. He's doing it behind all your backs. He told me one time, I don't have time to read. I'm like, yeah, right, okay, give me a break. See, right? I knew it. It's just because he's smarter than me. He says he doesn't have time, but his one day is worth 30 of mine. He's not here, so I can say this. It's not going to be in the recording, right? Like, do you think he's watching?
No, but I'm not.
But you're going to take it out of the online thing.
You really overestimate my tech.
Are you joking?
Yeah, no, I'm not. Like, I'm not giving.
Somebody help this man. Who's used the computer before?
I turn it on and off.
This is Mark, by the way, okay? Husband of Marlon, for those people who are watching, this is Mark I'm talking about, who's not good with technology. Was there anybody else? Sorry, I forgot who even asked that. No, I said I forgot who asked. I totally forgot where we started. I was going to say there's no way he wants me to repeat that answer. I don't even know what I said. Okay, so shall we call it there? Okay, cool.
I'm gonna turn off the live stream.
Why didn't you turn it off before? Or at least tell me, I'll take the microphone off. This